Greetings. Today we are going to discuss Physiocracy, a very strange sounding name, referring to a class of people called the Physiocrats, who were a group of economists writing in France in the mid-18th century. The French Physiocrats really play a very important role in the history of economic analysis. Remember, the previous major school of thought was the mercantile school of thought, and yet these writers and activists in the society were really narrow and self-interested, really just interested in policy that would help them make more money. They were not, generally speaking, theorists, although Thomas Munn made some important contributions. In contrast, the Physiocrats developed the very first model, or at least the first explicit model, of economic activity. It was called the tableau économique, or in English, the economic table. The physiocratic theory ignited the later analyses of Adam Smith and Karl Marx, as well as many modern writers. The physiocrats really analyzed their society with some care. Interestingly, time-wise, Adam Smith, actually in one of his journeys to France, spent some time visiting with Francois Quesnay, and the influence of Quesnay on Smith's writing is quite evident, as we shall see when we get to Adam Smith's work. The Physiocrats, they were not like the Mercantilists. They favored a class that really, they just really weren't a very powerful class. The Physiocrats were led by Francois Quesnay and the Marquis de Mirabeau, both in the court of Versailles, and both argued for policies that actually were not really implemented until well after the French Revolution of 1789. The problem for them was they did not represent a social class that had substantial power. They favored a class of rural entrepreneurs, or capitalists, rural capitalists, for reasons I'll explain shortly, but this class was not well organized. It was a potential at best social class. Interestingly, this is where we get the term entrepreneur, by the way, from the Physiocrats, one of their contributions, at least to economic language. So because they did not have a class foundation that was powerful, it could help us understand why their policies were not widely supported. Class power makes a big difference in who is going to have their ideas dominate a society. In the case of the mercantilists, balance of trade mercantilists like Thomas Munn defeated earlier bullionist ideas from the position of great wealth and political influence. They were very powerful because they had money and organization. In fact, the King of England had actually chartered the East India Company, as we noted before, in the early days of the 17th century, and had even attempted to become a member of the board of directors of this company. Interestingly, of course, he was rejected as a member of the board of directors, giving you a sense of how powerful the organized mercantilists really were. In the case of France, though, the Marquis de Mirabeau, for example, in one of his outings among the population where he was very popular for his book, The Friends of Mankind, he was actually jailed for his economic ideas despite his membership in the royal court in Versailles. Now, he did okay. He didn't stay in jail very long. But the fact that the King of France put this economist in jail, whereas the King of England was trying to cozy up to the mercantilists, it gives you a sense of the difference between these two schools of thought and their class strength. I wanted to turn now for a minute to the background of the Physiocrats in a philosophical sense. We should recognize that the Enlightenment was the period that influenced them, and within this, Francois Quesnay had a particular set of ideas. He advanced the physiocratic doctrine of natural law, or natural rights, or natural justice in his work Droit Naturel, and he argues that there were two major divisions to natural law, the physical and social. And he argues that the physical laws of nature are really fairly straightforward, that and he has this great phrase called, in which he says, the physical laws of nature are the laws of the trains of events as favorable as possible. to the happiness of all sentient beings. And so this means then that in his view, the world has been rationally constructed to bring happiness to the greatest number by the deity. And he even goes so far as to say that negative events actually are very positive as well. My favorite quote from Kane is the idea that the rain which inconveniences the traveler waters the field, so that even a negative effect would seem to be a very positive one in effect. And so the physical laws of nature are then the product of a God creating a marvelous world for his creatures. The social laws, he argues, though this is where it gets more interesting, are equally determinate. Now, they can nevertheless be broken by people due to their free will, but the social laws are definitely understandable. But we have to create, in the view of the Physiocrats, a coercive social system to guarantee that society actually functions according to these ideal laws. Now, these natural moral laws or social laws are fairly straightforward. The first is that the rules of prudent individual conduct be observed. These should be rational for each person, maximizing their satisfaction over the long run. Here we hear the traditional classical liberal view of hedonism that we'll be studying a bit later. Secondly, we have the rules of justice for the system of people as a whole. And this has to be enforced impartially over all people. And this rule of justice, then, means that the prudent behavior in number one is going to be limited so that they will be just towards other people who are also attempting to carry out prudent behavior. It reminds you a little bit of the sort of statement that one person's the liberty to swing your fist ends where somebody's nose begins, so that you don't have complete ability to just do whatever you want. The third natural moral law is simply the interaction of these two the first two natural moral laws, the kind of working out of the social economic processes if both are obeyed. Individual rational conduct is assumed to be increasingly the basis for human behavior, and so therefore we find that the first natural moral law is simple and clear, and if people are rational, it's somewhat questionable, but if people are in fact rational, then they will be able to carry out a reasonable, prudent activity for themselves. But the second natural moral law, the justice for people as a whole, is more challenging. This power is not to be limited. Kane, in fact, argued that something called legal despotism is to be desirable. He even has this idea of a constitutional monarchy where the monarch always obeys the rules of the game that are laid out in the Constitution and enforces them without mercy. So this makes you a little nervous because what monarch do we know from history has always obeyed the rules of the game? In fact, the monarch generally sets the rules of the game and then changes them whenever he or she would like to do that. However, in this view, this is what Kane felt was the way to do it, but he also argued for a balance of powers, so that he thought there should be a law-abiding executive as well as a legislative branch, and finally a court system of 9 wise old men. Now, that sounds a lot like the Supreme Court, doesn't it? And in fact, Kane and Thomas Jefferson and other framers of the Constitution were in fact in touch with each other. So the question, though, in this very general philosophical discussion, really begs the question of what are the details of the natural laws that are presented by Kane. These include the right to private property in land and movables. That's property that is not land, essentially. There should be freedom of contract. There should be freedom of economic enterprise, freedom of economic competition, and freedom of trade from legally or socially supported regulation, favoring one group over another. So this is clearly a slap at the mercantilists who lived and died on the basis of monopoly control over their economic sphere. The summary slogan of the Physiocrats then was laissez-faire, laissez-aller. So does this also sound familiar? Laissez-faire is certainly the trademark of traditional economics. Simply means let things go, don't try to interpose a lot of regulation. And so, like the term entrepreneur, laissez-faire is also an invention of the Physiocrats. And with that, I'm going to close this discussion, and we'll be ready for the second part of it when we will look at the economic setting in 18th century France.